This is Unit M and N, Part 6 of the Synaptic Gap Story. So let's get started. This unit covers what we talked about in Part 5, a nervous message traveling along one neuron. This now is the continuation of that idea. When the nerve impulse gets to the end of one neuron, how does it travel and connect to the next neuron? So if you have not yet looked at or don't know neuron structure, you would want to go back and review that first. Just quickly: dendrite, nucleus, cell body, Schwann cell, node of Ranvier, axon, and synaptic terminals. And that's where our story is going to take place today. So in this story, we are going to be looking at how the impulse travels from the synaptic terminal of one neuron, crosses the space, and starts the nerve impulse in the next neuron. So between two neurons. And this is what students find most confusing. They're going to get Part 5, the nerve impulse story, confused with this story. So we want to be absolutely clear we have it straight in our minds. So some key vocab here, some of it going back to the beginning of the year. The gap or cleft is going to be the space in between the two neurons. So this is one synaptic terminal blown up. These are what I call the nubby nubs, or the swellings at the end of our axon. The gap is the space. The presynaptic membrane is going to be the membrane on this side of the gap. Postsynaptic membrane, the membrane on the other side of the gap. The receptors, protein receptors, this goes back to Unit G, the cell membrane, are proteins that are embedded in the cell membrane, where the neurotransmitters, this is going to be a chemical message. So the neurons are going to release this neuron. The axon is going to release these chemicals. They'll cross the gap, bind to the receptors. Vesicles, remember, are the organelle that store the neurotransmitter. So neurotransmitters are going to be the chemicals that cross the gap. So one more time, if you didn't get it, right, if you didn't understand what this story is about, the story is about how the impulse travels down one neuron. That's the nerve impulse, but the story is going to be how does the message cross this gap? And I like this visual with the little looking like fireflies there. So looking and listening, you can pause it. You would need to be able to label these parts. The axon, right, is the ending. Remember, dendrite, cell body, axon. The nervous message always ends with the synaptic terminal. This is a cell, and here we're going to find mitochondria because we're going to have some active transport going on. The synaptic vesicles, they contain the neurotransmitters. The cleft or the gap, the store in the mall with 3 letters, is the space between the two neurons. This would be the dendrite of the second neuron, because remember, DCA, if this is A of one neuron, this will be the dendrite of the next. The postsynaptic membrane has receptors that the neurotransmitters will bind to, and the presynaptic membrane is going to release these neurotransmitters into the gap by exocytosis. That's why we need some mitochondria here to make ATP, because exocytosis is active transport. So the parts, let's very quickly draw it up and label it. If you can draw something, then you can probably remember it. So this would be the synaptic terminal. These would be the vesicles with the little dots, the neurotransmitters inside. This would be the postsynaptic membrane with, on the top, the surface, the receptors. So axon, no, I don't want that. It frustrates me, sorry. Axon, vesicles, dendrite of the next neuron, and receptors. Okay, so the order of events, what is going to occur in this story? Depolarization of the axon of the first neuron is going to cause the influx of another ion, calcium, Ca plus 2, and this is going to move to the inside of the axon. This is going to cause the vesicles to move to the membrane and allow for exocytosis, active transport of the synaptic vesicles that contain the neurotransmitters. So the neurotransmitters exit the cell by exocytosis. 4, the neurotransmitters will diffuse across the gap, the space, and the bane of my world is this pen. 5, they're going to bind into the postsynaptic membrane receptors. So these are the proteins that lie on the surface of the next cell membrane. So one more time, here it's nicely numbered. Variety is the spice of life. So the impulse arrives at the end of the neuron, the axon. This causes these gates to open, calcium gates. They open up, calcium diffuses in. So number 1. Number 2, this causes the vesicles to move to the presynaptic membrane. So the vesicles move. The neurotransmitters move by exocytosis into the gap. Then the neurotransmitters diffuse across the gap. The neurotransmitters bind to the receptors on the postsynaptic membrane, and this causes the sodium gates to open, which is going to cause the beginning of the nerve impulse on the next neuron. So 5 or 6 step story, and I say story because we need to know the beginning, the middle, and the end of it to make sense of it. Okay, so again, this is another graphic showing us in order. We could stop it here and write down the steps. We will go through this story in class a couple of times, and I really do recommend knowing it. It is one of the most commonly asked questions. Our whole world isn't about exams, but it has a good payoff for being ready for tests and exams. So one more time, the action potential arrives at the end of this neuron, the synaptic terminal. This causes calcium, another ion that we only find at the end of axons. We don't find this elsewhere. This causes the vesicles to move to the membrane. The neurotransmitters move by exocytosis into the gap. The neurotransmitters diffuse across the gap. They diffuse across. So there's 2 things going on here. Exocytosis out, diffusion across. This is active. ATP. Diffusion is passive. The neurotransmitters bind into the receptor sites. They cause the sodium gates to open, and an action potential begins, a nerve impulse begins in the next neuron, the next cell. Okay? So this little graphic, just giving you an overview. The green balls obviously are the neurotransmitters. They move out by, saying it one more time, exocytosis. They diffuse across, they bind in, and that causes a reaction, the impulse to occur on the next neuron. An example of a neurotransmitter that we actually need to know by name, acetylcholine, remembering this is from the parasympathetic nervous system. At the end of a story, an enzyme comes in to break down the neurotransmitter. Otherwise, the neurotransmitter would continue to excite the next neuron. So we need a way to clean up the remaining neurotransmitters after the message has been transmitted. And this is an example of a neurotransmitter we must know by heart, and this enzyme we should be aware of. So the key ideas in this unit, we talked about how a message is transmitted between 2 neurons, and we should realize that the message is chemical. The name of the chemical transmitting the message is a neurotransmitter. Specifically, we should know the name acetylcholine. Hope that helped.